Good afternoon, everybody. This is Marilyn Trader. I'm the Southeast Regional Representative for the Helen Keller National Center. I am super excited to be here, continuing to host with my awesome Deafblind projects this great Southeast Deafblind webinars for all of you. So we are so excited to have part 2 today with Chris Russell from New York. So thank you again, Chris, for being here.
Okay, this is Chris Russell. Thank you so much. I do have the chat box open, so please do feel free to type in your questions, points for clarification, comments. Even if you have like examples of something with your own student or child, welcome those as well. As usual, I always have too much content and not enough time. So I won't have like a Q&A time set aside at the end. I'll just ask you to type in anything you want to say as we go. First, I just want to say massive thank you once again to Marilyn, as well as to Donna and Dana and Robert and Marcy for having me. This is part 2. Hopefully many of you were on for part 1, although part 1 was more of like an overview of CVI characteristics and phases, and a little bit on intervention and assessment kind of woven into that. We're going to talk a lot more about intervention as we discuss it in the specific context of AAC and communication. So as I get started and give a little bit of context and background, can everyone just type into the chat box your what your role is, just so again I can get just a a general idea of the variety of different professional roles that are here, as well as if there are family members here, state projects. Cool. All right. I'm not going to read all those out, of course, but it's just good to kind of see them coming in. You in the chat box, you as participants will know kind of the range of people who's here, and I'm just kind of scanning it and getting a really nice sense of the very diverse group of professionals that we have here, as well as family members. Always really happy to see a handful of family members participating in these. So great. Okay, awesome. And hi to my friends. I'm seeing several colleagues and friends in the chat box. Glad that you could be here. Okay, so I'm just going to get right into it. I'm the project coordinator of the New York Deafblind Collaborative, New York's Deafblind Project. My background is as a TVI, teacher of blind visually impaired, as well as a classroom teacher working with students with multiple disabilities and specifically complex communication needs and visual impairments. So this is a topic that's very dear to my heart. And as I got kind of further and further into learning about and developing some of my own specific content and ideas and approaches around CVI, this is the one that I really kind of attached to and connected with the most. And I'll explain kind of why and what the context is behind that. Okay, so just once again, a little bit on the background, just kind of credit to where credit's due, and I don't have to spend too much time on this, but just to say that we are talking specifically about the approaches to intervention that are based on the CVI range assessment created by Dr. Roman Lancy. And a lot of the ideas and examples I have here, just like in the first session, are really from my collaboration with other professionals. I'm also going to share with you an instrument or resource that I developed with the project coordinator of the Maryland Deafblind Project, Jennifer Willis. And I'll be happy to share that with you towards the end of the presentation. I'll walk you through it a little bit too. So if you weren't on the last session, I did share a fact sheet on CVI, a 2-page fact sheet on CVI that I made maybe like a year ago. This is sort of answering a lot of the frequently asked questions and giving definitions and overview of CVI, as well as resources. The second page not shown here is resources for a whole variety of topics related to CVI. So this is just to save you the time of having to re-explain all of this stuff yourself. I can share the link with you again a little later on too, but it's also up on pathstoliteracy.org. Okay, so this is just everything that I talked about last session. Okay, so let's get right into the issues around AAC and CVI. As a state deafblind project employee, providing technical assistance across the state of New York, going into lots of classrooms, working with lots of teams who serve students with CVI, and also additional hearing loss, so kids with CVI who are also deafblind, I was noticing what I could really only call a significant mismatch between communication systems and visual access. And I got this term, significant mismatch. I actually got that specific term from a Susan Bruce article. Susan Bruce has written a lot of amazing journal articles and done some really important work around understanding the development of symbolism and shared forms of communication with children who are deafblind and their communication partners or providers. And she used that term significant mismatch to describe the modes of communication that were being used by teachers and communication partners versus the modes of communication that were being used by students. And what she said is that there was a major disconnect happening. Now, I'm seeing a very similar type of major disconnect, and I'm sure that if you've been out in the field viewing a lot of different teams, working with kids with visual impairments and specifically CVI and complex communication needs, you may also be seeing these mismatches. The mismatches that I was identifying were between the communication level and the visual adaptation or the visual level. So for example, on the one hand, you might have communication that looks really great from a communication standpoint, usually because there's a great speech pathologist or great AAC specialist who's really kind of figured out exactly what the student needs from a communication standpoint, but it's visually not appropriate. Or on the other hand, you have communication that visually looks awesome, and usually that's because you have a great TVI or a person on the team who really understands CVI, but it's inappropriate in terms of the communication level, the current expressive level of the student's communication. So this is almost like a scale that's out of balance with communication on one side and vision on the other side. For example, an eye gaze system for a student in phase 1. There is no way that an eye gaze system is appropriate for a student in phase 1. And the reason for that is that in phase 1, the child is not making eye to object contact. They're not able to look at an object directly with direct visual fixation, central eye to object contact. Instead, kids in phase 1, if they're looking at things, it's sort of that indirect look, or what we would call a regard rather than a fixation. Right? So if you're not able to make a fixation, a prolonged fixation, there's just no way that an eye gaze system is going to be appropriate. Yet, kids get recommended eye gaze systems because they don't have motor control. They don't have voluntary motor control. They can't actually physically do the reach, or they don't have other strong areas of motor control that could be used to access switches and communication. So the automatic response for those kids is, oh, eye gaze system. But if they're in phase 1 or early phase 2, and arguably, which I'll talk about in a bit, if they're even a little further on into phase 2, they still might not be appropriate for an eye gaze system. So that would be communication that looks good from a communication standpoint, but not from a visual standpoint. On the other side, the example of a student who's in phase 3, much closer to typical visual functioning, is using a complex 2D iPad system, like with Proloquo to go, or LAMP or something like that, using a high-tech communication device that's beautifully adapted and looks really great. Reduced visual complexity, the use of color, very distinct visual features, but the child's currently a pre-symbolic communicator. The child doesn't know the meaning of any of those symbols and isn't able to use a single one of those symbols accurately. So that would be communication that is inappropriate on a communication level, but looks good visually. And one of the kind of disclaimers that I'll give again and again in this session is that I'm not talking about receptive communication. I'm not talking about what a student understands. I'm talking about what a student is currently doing expressively. Okay, so that idea of a balance, a scale, right? We want to create a balance between the communication level access. Is the child pre-symbolic or symbolic? Do they have the understanding of symbolism yet? Are they pre-linguistic or linguistic? And avoid at all costs, avoid using the term verbal or nonverbal, because that is a speech-centric term, right? Instead, use pre-symbolic or symbolic. A child may not ever have verbal speech, and that's okay. They may still have language in other ways. So we'll use those terms instead. And then on the other side of the scale, we're talking about a balance with sensory access, right? And that could be the CVI phase and the unique impact of the characteristics on that individual child, which are different from the unique impact of those characteristics on, say, another child. And also their preferred learning channels, right? Which may also be an individual thing and maybe needs to be worked out with additional assessment, like a learning media assessment or a sensory balance profile, which we'll talk about a little bit too. My little disclaimers on the bottom here, we're still talking about multimodal communicators. We're not trying to limit what a student can access. We're still providing a robust AAC program receptively. And I know that term robust is one that I hear a lot of speech pathologists use, and it's a great term. We're still providing exposure and access to language and to symbolism, but we need to scaffold that with where the student is currently in their expressive development. And then on the other side, the kind of disclaimers for sensory access is we're still talking about multisensory. Doesn't have to be all visual, all tactile, all auditory, right? We're thinking about multiple access points. And we're still talking about universal design principles that should be helpful to everyone. I think we're probably right about at interpreter switch.
Yep, perfect timing. Switch. Great, perfect, Kirk. Thank you so much.
This is Chris, thank you. So here's a little friendly service announcement from ASHA, reminding us that AAC is not just high tech, right? I think it's our go-to thought process that when we hear AAC, we think high tech device, right? But AAC includes all forms of communication, and according to ASHA, it's other than oral speech, that are used to express thoughts, needs, wants, and ideas. We all use AAC when we make facial expressions or gestures, use symbols or pictures, or write. The only thing I would change about ASHA's definition here, if I may, is that they are speech-centric here, aren't they? We really should say other than oral speech or sign language, right? So ASHA would actually consider sign language to be AAC, but I think that we don't. So, but this is to remind you that AAC includes even things like gestures and facial expressions. So there's low tech, there's no tech, there's light tech, there's medium tech, and then there's high tech. And we'll look at kind of each of those. And we all know from working with our students or children who are multimodal communicators that we all use multiple modes of communication, but our students may use those different modalities, different forms or ways of communicating, either at the same time or at different times for different purposes. The student may shift modes throughout the day because of the context, because of the ease of accessing that mode, because of fatigue, and then for children with CVI, because of multisensory complexity. So this is something that's unique about kids with CVI as it relates to modalities of communication. Some modes are going to be accessible when the child's feeling great and not overstimulated. And that same modality, if it's a visual one, is going to be much harder or maybe even not possible for the student to access when they're overstimulated. And we'll look at ways of measuring that and thinking about it. Student may also use multiple modes in the same setting or use different modes with different people, right? Because they've learned, oh, this is the person who signs with me, so I'm going to sign more with that person, but I'm not going to do that with anyone else. So it's important as a communication partner to work with all of the students' other communication partners to understand what those modalities look like and to help them practice them in other settings and start to generalize them. So multiple modes, multiple systems, right? Aided and unaided. Aided meaning requires something else, requires requires either another person or requires an actual component like an object or a device. Unaided doesn't. Unaided you can just do with your body. No tech, light tech, and high tech. And there's different ways of explaining that too. Some speech pathologists use low tech instead of light tech, or mid tech is even another distinction. You'll see in the images here a variety of aided, unaided, no tech, light tech, high tech, right? The first question that you want to ask, and I think this is maybe the most important thing to clarify, is, does this student have symbolism? Symbolism is the understanding, but it's also the use of a symbol to refer to an event, activity, object, or person. So in order to have symbolism, you have to have a symbol. And in this case, we're using like a water bottle cap. And the cap itself, the water bottle cap, refers to the referent, which is a bottle of water, right? So could you show that symbol to a student, whether they're touching it, whether they're looking at it? It's a symbol, and the object that it refers to, the referent, the water bottle, is nowhere near. It's in a whole other room even. It's far away. It can't be referred to directly. It's being referred to indirectly with the cap. Can your student touch or look at that cap and recognize and use it to be able to request or comment on or reject water? Okay. And obviously we have a range of concreteness to abstractness to refer to that. And you may think, well, a water bottle cap is like a very concrete representation of water, right? That's called iconicity. Iconicity is a scale or a range from concrete to abstract. So the most concrete is an icon. That would be the whole water bottle itself, or maybe even like the cap, a part of the water bottle, could be an icon. It's something that bears, and you can think of an icon as something that bears a close or strong resemblance to the referent. There's a very close connection visually, conceptually, and even tactily, if your student's a tactile learner, between the symbol and the referent. Okay, so that's an object or a part of an object. Then the next level of abstractness is an index. An index doesn't bear a strong resemblance to the referent, but does bear some light resemblance. And in an index, you need to have some background concepts. You need to have some conceptual understanding to be able to look at this image. And the image I'm showing on the screen is like the Boardmaker or Mayor Johnson symbol for water, right? You have to look at this and understand, oh, that little weird gray shape that we're seeing there coming from the right, that's a water faucet, right? And we know that's a water faucet because we've seen other water faucets that look like that and have the handle on the top and have that shape. And those lines coming out from under it, and the wavy lines even under there, and the blue color, that's a representation of water. Okay, so this might seem like a given, right? It might seem something obvious, but we take for granted that we have all of those background concepts, and we can look at this and think, oh yeah, that's water. That means water. It doesn't bear a super strong resemblance to the referent. The most abstract symbol, and what we would call a true abstract symbol, bears no resemblance to the referent. The symbol bears absolutely no resemblance and does not look like or feel like, from a sensory or from a conceptual standpoint, what it refers to. So if you're looking at this on the right side, and go ahead, type into the chat box, has anybody figured out what that is? Atoms. Yeah, it's H2O, right? It's the water molecule, right? Okay, so it's the large oxygen molecule and the two little hydrogen molecules attached to it, right? So I think we could all agree that we would never use this as a communication symbol for one of our students, right? It's a given. It seems absolutely ridiculous. It's a very abstract way to represent water. So we all accept that that would be too abstract. But how often do we pick the one in the middle instead and think of all of the assumptions that we're making about what our student understands in order to recognize and utilize that symbol in the middle? And how is that symbol in the middle really any more understandable to your student who has never had an experience with this kind of two-dimensional shape and made a connection that that two-dimensional shape represents water, or even the blue lines, that itself is an abstract way of thinking about water. Water doesn't look like that, right? And water certainly doesn't feel like that. So my point here is that some kids may be fine with an index. Some kids may actually have some of that conceptual understanding, or maybe just by repetition, they've learned that index symbol that you've given them means what you've connected it with. But how often are we seeing kids stagnate and not make progress with index systems? And the reason is because they need something that's more concrete, that either looks like, feels like, or conceptually feels more like their experiences, right? So it's not that it's always inappropriate, but it's a question to ask yourself. Okay. And I see a question, is the item icon and is a photo of the item icon or index? No. Oh, okay. Charlotte, thank you for asking. So the icon is not the object itself. The icon is something that feels like or looks very much like the object. So the actual object that you use, like I have a water bottle right here, if I wanted to turn this into a symbol, it cannot be the same one that I'm using. That's object communication. In order to make this a symbol, even a very iconic symbol, I've got to separate it from the actual object. So I might do that by like mounting it on a cardboard, on a piece of cardboard, or maybe just using the cap, or maybe cutting it in half and mounting it on the cardboard. Or if the student is really truly a visual learner, maybe I'm just going to take a photograph of it, and that bears a close enough resemblance. But using an object itself to communicate about the object, that's not symbolism. That's just object communication. Okay, so an icon looks very much like the one that you're using, but it has to be a separate thing from the one that you're using. Yeah, thanks for asking. It's an important question. So also consider that iconicity varies based on individual experience. So is this your child or your student's experience with water? Is it this water bottle? Is it this water bottle, which is a personal, reusable water bottle, like a canteen? Or is it a cup that your student usually gets water at school or at home from a specific cup? And if that's the one, then why would you use a water bottle cap? Because your student has no connection with that. Okay. And if this is your child's experience with water, right, the water fountain, then that's going to be unique too, right? So what we're thinking about here, and now let's connect it back to CVI, iconicity is similar to novelty, to visual novelty, or to the experience of the characteristic of difficulty with novelty. It's totally relative to individual experience. So in addition to being thoughtful about how complex, abstract versus how concrete is your symbol, you also have to think about how close is your symbol to your child or your student's familiarity with it. Okay. So that's just a little bit of sort of foundational background, and we could spend a lot more time on that, but we'll keep moving. In New York, we created this, I think maybe I shared this with you last time, maybe not. We created this communication poster, and we printed it out like a classroom door-sized poster. And once we're able to get back into our offices, I have a stack of these, which I'm happy to send out to your state deafblind projects. We have lots and lots of them. But what this is basically, it's a kind of a hands-on, easy way of explaining communication development in the way that the communication matrix, which I'll discuss, looks at. You have levels of communication on the left side in those little colored boxes. Then you have examples of what the behaviors look like that fit into each of those levels. Then you have strategies that you might use with the child who is communicating at that level. And then you've got a little column on the right to write in information about your own student. So it's basically a user-friendly way of explaining communication, development, and assessment. What we're asking is, where is your child expressively? Not receptively, not what do they understand, just where are they receptive or expressively. And we're thinking about mastered levels. Those are levels of communication that your student is using across routines, across communication partners, for a variety of purposes and functions, as well as emerging levels or emerging skills that your child or student maybe is using only in one or two examples. And the easiest one for me to think of is a student that I had who was starting to sign more, right? It was her first real abstract word, signing more, but she only signed more during mealtime. She wasn't yet connecting that you could also use more, during a playtime, during a sensory activity, during a music, during anything else. So it wasn't quite mastered. It was emerging. It's great, but it's just emerging. And is your student using these levels and skills across functions of communication? 4 primary functions of communication in the communication matrix. That is to refuse things that you don't want, to request things that you do want, to socially engage with other people, and to provide or seek information. And is your student using these communicative behaviors across routines and across communication partners, or are they only doing it in certain activities and with certain people? Okay. And
So Chris?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, sure. And just a reminder, everyone, this is Marilyn speaking. The chart that he just showed you, again, reach out to your Deafblind project and we'll ensure that your Deafblind project coordinator gets these communication charts. Go ahead to be sent to you, okay? And just let them know it's Chris Russell's chart there. All right. Kirk, you ready to switch, please? You're good.
Awesome. This is Chris. Thank you. Yes, absolutely. So, and I saw Donna also just put in the chat box the link to communicationmatrix.org. We could spend like at least a whole hour just talking about the communication matrix. But if you are not familiar with it, I would definitely go and check it out. A lot of what I'm going to be discussing fits into the levels of communication that are identified on the communication matrix, which is essentially an assessment of expressive communication on a pre-linguistic level. So if your child or student is communicating on a pre-language level, this is going to be a great tool to assess where they're currently at expressively, and sort of a starting point from which to base all of our considerations for CVI that I will be discussing today. Okay. So just some thoughts around this, and this was sort of just me like thinking aloud a little bit about what's unique about considerations for CVI. Well, you don't need language and symbolism to reach phase 2 and late phase 3. That's a major misconception about CVI, that kids only get into phase 3 if they have language. But a lot of the assessment protocol for phase 3 is language based, right? It involves identification of 2D symbols, right? And how do you identify 2D symbols if you don't have symbolism and language? So this is a problem, I think, that we need to sort of find creative solutions for, because what it means is that some of the protocol for assessment of CVI, as we get higher up into phase 3, we really have to be careful not to discredit what kids are able to do just because they have complex communication needs and they can't yet do these things. But can they do them from a visual perspective, not from a conceptual perspective? So we can sort of try to work through some of these things, and I will try to talk through some of these, but I wouldn't say that I have clear answers to this question yet. If any, as I usually say, when a problem comes up, if anybody else wants to work with me on figuring out this problem, just reach out to me. I'm always all about collaboration. And if you have some thoughts around this particular issue or any other issues I bring up, just reach out and maybe we'll find something to collaborate on. So that is a big issue though, and that's one that we're going to see when we get into phase 2 and 3. Once again, we're not talking about what the student is capable of or what he or she understands receptively. We're really just talking about expressive communication here. And the modifications, the adaptations, are ones primarily made to expressive modes. The only exception to that is that I will give you some guidelines for modifying receptive access to sign language for students with CVI, which is, definitely works both receptively and expressively. Okay, so the idea is that we are modeling abstract modes of communication. We're still providing access and exposure to language for our students with complex communication needs, but we're scaffolding those abstract modes with concrete modes that are at your students' current expressive levels. We're not going over their heads expressively and giving them a system that is just too much for them to use, like the 2D iPad system with 40 icons on it, all beautifully adapted, but the student doesn't know the meaning of them yet. And so we don't make progress. Okay. So I'm not going to spend very much time on early symbolic and pre-symbolic modalities of communication, but I just wanted to share a couple with you. And one very important one is touch cues. And actually, I see that Julie Meyer is on the presentation. The best resource for touch cues that I know of is the California Deafblind Services fact sheet. I don't know how old it is, but it still is 150% relevant. So I don't know if anyone can find that and throw it in the chat box. It's fantastic, and it really explains touch cues very well. Hi, Julie. So touch cues. A touch cue is essentially a light touch that is made consistently. It's a tactile cue that is made consistently on a specific part of the student's body to express. It can be used receptively or expressively, but typically the way that I see them being used is as a receptive cue to anticipate an event or something that's going to happen next, right? So this is to reduce stress and to make a strong connection between what's, the cue and then what's going to happen after the cue. And if you have a student for whom this sounds relevant, I would encourage you to try to create an inventory of touch cues. Just write them down, get them on a chart, like a one-page chart, 5 to 10 starting touch cues to communicate whatever it is that's necessary to communicate for your student. And it's going to tell you what the cue is, how to do it, what it means, and then you're going to make sure that everyone on the team has that. And thank you, Julie, for that. So here's some examples of touch cues, right? Hello, right? Anybody who's going to come and have an interaction with the student is going to start by a light touch cue, touching hand on shoulder or back, right? And then allow for a little processing time if necessary before you do anything else. Sit down could be a gentle pressure on the shoulder going downwards. Stand up could be a gentle pressure upwards on the elbow. Eat, drink, touching their fingers to their lips. Toileting, a gentle tap on or touch on the side or hip. Right, you can see where we're going here. The ones that I really appreciate are like the ones on the bottom there. How often do you see a child, you're going to put on or take off ankle orthotics or shoes, and you see someone come up to the child and say, hey, it's time to put on your orthotics, and then goes for their shoe, pulls it off, and puts the orthotic on, and the student is stressed because the student maybe doesn't yet understand the verbal or signed cue, we're going to put on your orthotics. They need something more concrete, like a light touch on the shin, and then a little bit of wait time. And every time we get that light touch on the shin, it means we're going to do something around that area where your feet are, right? And these can make a very big difference. Same thing with glasses or cochlear implants, or light touch in the area, right? Okay. So thinking about hand under hand too, because like a lot of touch cues and a lot of exploration involves hand under hand. And we always talk about hand under hand as being much more appropriate than hand over hand, right? Hand over hand, where someone's physically taking the child's hand and manipulating it and moving around. It's not only intrusive and manipulative, but it also really serves no purpose, because if you're using hand over hand, the child's not doing anything. the child is just being treated like a puppet who's being moved around, right? Hand underhand, where your hand is underneath the child's hand, not blocking their fingers from accessing, but just kind of providing a light anchor and a support for exploring. We always talk about that as being much less intrusive and way more appropriate for our students who are deafblind or who have visual impairments and complex communication needs. However, how does hand under hand impact multisensory complexity? When you're in tactile contact with a student, aren't you increasing their multisensory complexity? So it's something we do have to be aware of. Could hand under hand support visually guided reach, right? For a student who needs that extra support, are there other considerations? Do we need a little more processing time if we're using hand under hand? Because the child needs to be able to look away first in response to that multisensory complexity, and then maybe look back, right? So just consider that hand under hand is definitely more appropriate than overhand, but it does serve to increase the complexity for a student with CVI. Okay, and thanks so much for that, Julie, and the object communication one there too. Okay, so concrete modes of communication you can see are right in the middle there, right? That's tangible symbols, object cues, photos, and drawings. I'll spend a little bit of time reviewing some CVI adaptations to tangible symbols, object cues, photos. What you'll notice here is that we made concrete symbols not an actual level of communication. It's really a bridge. And to be very clear, what I mean by that is that tangible symbols should not be considered, or object cues should not be considered as an end, as like the final, step in the child's communication. It's not going to be their final mode. It's really a bridge or a stepping stone between pre-symbolic and symbolic communication. So it's a means to achieve symbolism for a student who doesn't have symbolism yet. And then once they have it, it's a means to expand their early symbolism to start to build some more complex communication systems. And I'll give you examples of that. Some considerations for tangible symbols. In general, tangible symbols can be whole objects, right? Like we talked about, they could be the full water bottle, but it has to be not the same one that you're using, which is why we usually put them on a cardboard backing. The cardboard backing or the plastic backing is what says this is a symbol. It's not an object to be used. It's a symbol that refers to another object. It can be a part of an object, cut some of it off or use the cap or something. It can be an associated object, a texture or a shape that's meant to refer to that object. Line drawings and photographs are also tangible symbols depending on how they're being used. Whatever you're using, consider the level of iconicity that's appropriate for your student. In terms of photos and line drawings, I think we could all agree which would be more abstract, right? Line drawings are obviously more abstract than photographs. Who should use them, right? For CVI, photos or line drawings are simply not accessible until a child has eye-to-object contact. There's no reason to use a 2D image, whether it's a photo or a drawing, before a child has eye-to-object contact. And what we learned last webinar was that you should expect that at around 4 to 5 on the CVI range, which is the early to middle of phase 2. So a child in phase 1 or early phase 2, it's not going to be appropriate. There's just no context in which a 2D symbol is going to work. But it's not just about, do they have enough vision? Are they in phase 2 or 3? It's also, do they have an understanding of what the photo or drawing represents in terms of novelty, right? In terms of experience, and also in terms of abstract concepts. You see here on the top right, there's a little a young girl with CVI looking at a photograph of a trampoline. And that's the real trampoline that she actually uses. Now, since taking this photograph, I've realized something, which is that it's actually better not to have the background be a bright color, because if the whole background's a bright color, then the bright color is what the student's looking at, not the photograph on top of it. So a little bright color outline is good, but it's better to have the background be black. And we'll see some better examples of that. On the bottom right, you have examples of board maker symbols, right? Mayor Johnson line drawings, very abstract. And that's because this is a communication system that was really designed for children with autism who have expressive language and maybe even have abstract expressive language, but just are not verbal communicators. And so look at the concepts, right? I mean, the one on the left here, it takes a little bit of time to even figure out what that is. Anybody figure out what that one on the left is? What's the symbol? Shadow. Yep, that's the symbol for shadow. Imagine that. They have a board maker symbol for shadow. Maybe it's late afternoon too. So in order to understand that that's shadow, think about all the concepts you have to have. You have to have an understanding that when the sun shows light in a certain direction at a certain thing, it creates that black shape that is like a mimic of the shape of the object itself. And you also have to understand that when an arrow is pointing at something, that's the main thing that it wants you to focus on. That is so abstract. And there's so many complex concepts that are involved in that symbol. My point is, if you can use that symbol to understand that word, why can't you just use the word itself, the sight word shadow? It's way less visually complex, and it's way less conceptually complex. So these symbols were not designed for our population of students. And so the use of these symbols for our population of students needs to be viewed with a little bit of, salt or whatever. So this is a nice kind of classic example of a little guy with CVI who's looking at two photographs of real objects that he actually knows and connects with to make a choice. I wish I had this as a video, because what the teacher does, she holds them up, nicely spaced apart. She moves the one on the left a little bit. So the student shifts his gaze to look at it using a little bit of movement, stops, pauses, moves the one on the right a little bit, stops, and then the student looks for and reaches for the one that he wants. Okay. So, and it's okay. He's kind of looking a little bit away, first looking, then looking away while he reaches. And then immediately there's the reinforcement and the connection that the symbol refers to the object. It's a pretty straightforward sequence for choice making with concrete photo symbols. Okay. In terms of uses of tangible symbols, and this is like my biggest pet peeve in the use of tangible symbols. And I don't really know if this exists anywhere in terms of, the literature on tangible symbols, but I've realized that when tangible symbol systems don't work for kids, it's because students are using them on the wrong level. I think that there are really two major levels of using tangible symbols. One is for students who don't have symbolism yet. They don't yet understand the connection between a symbol and a referent, right? So the first use is just anticipation, right? And I guess this is actually what in the literature you would call an anticipation calendar. I think some of that is on the link that Julie shared on object communication. So that would just be an anticipation calendar for a student who doesn't yet know symbolism. For a student who does have symbolism and is able to recognize and use individual symbols, then we can start expanding it into transitional communication systems, more complex uses, including the use of calendars, sequence boards, choice boards, literacy activities using symbols, and conversations, right? So if you have a child or a student who doesn't yet have symbolism and needs symbols on a communication, on an anticipation level, there are really six steps, six major steps in this sequence. It's fairly straightforward. Show the symbol, okay? Pair it with language, whether it is signed or spoken, whatever's appropriate to your student, right? So time for speech, right? Time to go to speech. Here's the speech symbol, time for speech. Within 30 seconds, and maybe for some students even sooner, even like immediately, pair the symbol with the referent. Go to the activity or bring out the thing that it refers to. You don't want too much time to go by between showing the symbol and connecting it to the referent, right? Because if you let too much time go by, the connection disappears and the student doesn't realize what we're connecting with. This is the one that people usually forget. Make sure that you bring the symbol with you to the activity. And the reason for that is that you want to continue to reintroduce and refer to the symbol every few minutes during the activity. The reason for this is simply exposure. It's estimated, and knowing that there's a lot of speech pathologists on this call, if somebody has the reference for this or maybe even more reliable information, then do post it. It's estimated that you need to experience a word, a first word. You need to experience it about 1,000 times before you're going to grasp the meaning of that first word. So if you think about it, you're really not going to have, your student is not going to learn that word if you show it once a day. Time for gym, and then it's gone. I see Deborah is saying yes 1,000 times. Yeah, if anybody has a reference for that, everyone's always asking me for the reference, but the reference I have is just that somebody told me that one time, and I thought it was fascinating. So I would love to have an actual citation. So, right, if you're going to have gym once a day and you're only showing the symbol one time, then it's going to take you 3 or 4 years to learn the symbol for gym. Deborah learned it in college. Maybe this is like a great, like just a great informal piece of knowledge that nobody knows, but I think it's a good one. And it does just the idea of that. It reinforces that we really need multiple consistent exposure many, 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 many times. So instead, if you can bring that gym symbol with you to the gym, and every few minutes during the gym activity, keep referring back to it. Look, we're still in gym. We're still in gym. We're still in gym. Have a symbol outside the gym that you're pairing it with. Look, that's the gym. We're here. The gym is a place, and it's also an activity. The more that you can refer to it, the closer your student is going to get to recognizing and being able to refer to it themselves. Yeah. And then the other one that people often forget is make sure that you have a finished box, which is just any container into which the symbols that are representing activities that are done or finished are always put into. And make sure that your student is part of the process of putting the symbol in the finished box. Don't just take it from them and put it in yourself and say, okay, finished. Make sure that they're a part of it. And then repeat, right? So this is for a student who's just on the anticipation level, still needs to learn the meaning of the symbol. And you can do this for, a handful of symbols. You don't want to do this for symbols that you're not going to have an opportunity to experience very often. So a child who's on an anticipation level, I'm not going to give you a strict number, but I would say usually, really probably no more than between 10 and 20 symbols max for anticipation level. Because when you go above that, you're talking about things that don't occur often enough or frequently enough to be able to refer to. Once they learn an individual symbol, you'll see that they start to pick up the other ones pretty quickly too. And suddenly now we're on the next level, which is really more of the transitional communication system. Here's an example of that's the American Printing House for the Blind, the APH stacks symbol, STACS, right, for speech. Really funny story about this. A student that I was working with up in Albany, who is in a mainstream classroom and in an elementary school, and she's the only student who uses these symbols at her school. And so we made sure that all of the different all the different locations around the school had the labels. So the speech room was going to have the speech symbol outside of it. The gym was going to have the gym symbol outside of it. And as we were observing the student, I saw 2 little girls, maybe 11 or maybe 10 or 11, walking down the hallway, walking past the speech room. And I saw one of them pointed at the symbol and said, "Hey, did you know what that is? That's the kissing booth." So it was like pretty funny. Yeah, it's always kind of weird choice that they make for some of those symbols. So tangible symbols as landmarks or labels, they can be official ones that are matched with the ones that you have there, or they can be, individualized ones. Like every student's locker, even the other students who don't use tangible symbols, every student's locker or cubby is labeled with a unique texture. And that's because that texture on a concrete level, it represents that that's an individual person, and that's an individual person's name. You're also going to have maybe that same label on every individual student's chair or desk so that your student can find their own one, but they can also start to recognize that other people also have labels and names too. Okay. So I'm not going to spend tons of time on this at all, but communication system level for tangible symbols is just expanding it to the other ways that you usually think about using tangible symbols, for calendars, for schedules, for sequence boards, whatever they look like, for literacy and for conversations. And there's tons of resources on this. But I think the big point is your students not ready for this expansive system if they don't know the meaning of any of the symbols. Then they need to focus on just learning symbolism and that major achievement of symbolism. There's some really good examples, I think, especially on paths to literacy, of object schedules specifically for kids with CVI. The one piece of advice I'd give you here is these are just ideas for a certain child. That doesn't mean that they're going to work for your child or student, but they're great ideas. And this one in particular, I think it's from a parent who posted this. It it gives an example of a object schedule system that grew with the student as the student's vision improved and communication improved. So we see beginning to communicate with actual objects in little calendar boxes, and then starting to transition those into partial objects or more like tangible symbols, and then starting to transition those into photographs and even sight words, right? As the student's vision improved and the student went on into phase 2, I'm assuming probably later phase 2, and was able to use photographs instead of whole objects. But the communication isn't lost because the symbol, it transformed at the same time as the student's communication was improving and their vision was. And then that continues to expand into a schedule board and into a more abstract communication system. So this kind of says it all, right? And you can see the CVI specific adaptations here too. There's also a great example by Rachel Bennett, who is the coordinator of the Perkins eLearning's CVI Now project now. And she gave a good example of a sequence board for her son that you can see all the CVI adaptations here, right? Real photographs, a little color outline rather than the whole color background. You see the use of color on the board itself or the tray to anchor the child's attention to those specific areas. And you also see this green dot and this red dot to help kind of orient in space like a color landmark adaptation. Okay. Now, Rachel was also kind enough to share with me a specific case study for her son Henry's communication system, where she said, because I asked her about that post, and she said, well, it's interesting because he is able to attend. He's in mid-phase 2 at this point. He's able to attend to 2D pictures on an iPad or on, photo cues. But when he gets visually fatigued, he's not able to use those. And so when he's visually fatigued, he needs to actually be able to have access to a tactile 3D communication system. So we need to be doing both at the same time, and we need to be recognizing when the 2D system is available or accessible and when the 3D system is accessible. So we have these examples of his 3D system. Even though he uses a 2D iPad communication device, he also needs this sequence board, which I think are pretty good examples of tangible symbols adapted for a child with CVI. Oh, and thank you so much, Julie. I bet you didn't think you'd be like in charge of posting all of the links today, but thank you, I really appreciate it. There's the link to expanding the communication system. So you can see these kind of nice examples. You see the reduced array of the background, the use of bright colors, the spacing between objects. And then most importantly, I think you see that these symbols are very visually distinct from each other. And that's the number one point that I want to make about symbol selection. No matter what they look like, make sure that they look distinct and different from each other, and especially from those symbols that are next to them. And usually we can do that by color, but it may be also by shape that we're making things look distinct. Here are some more. Some of these I thought were really creative. The one for taking a walk was like a little cane. And then look, the one on the bottom right is for going swimming, and it's an actual piece of an old life jacket. So that's pretty clever. Okay, so for the last half hour, I want to walk you through this tool or instrument that Jen Willis, the coordinator from the Maryland Deafblind Project, and I made, which is the AAC CVI matrix.
And let's go ahead and do an interpreter switch.
Cool. Oh, thank you. So I want to open it up for you first and just show you what it looks like, and then I'll go back to the PowerPoint. Okay. This is not posted on the internet yet. I don't know, we're trying to just figure out where to post it, but I'm happy to send it to you, and I can send it to all of your state deafblind project folks, and you're welcome to share it. It's open to the public now. So this is this instrument that Jen and I made, and I'll just walk you through it, and then I'll go back to the presentation and show you some examples. So it's basically a set of guidelines and a way of figuring out what adaptations might be appropriate to your child. Okay, so the first few pages are just background context, and especially, it's asking you before you even begin, make sure you have the background info on CVI and you have the background info on communication. This tool is essentially a balance between the CVI range results and the communication matrix results. So you really need to have assessment results from both the CVI range and from the communication matrix. And once you have those two, we're going to show you how to balance them. So you'll recognize some of these things here, even like some little screenshots of slides that I've talked you through today. This is just some of the background context, explaining where we're coming from, giving you some little tips. Right, all this is kind of background. Modalities of AAC, and we'll zoom in a little bit for you. Okay, the communication matrix. The communication matrix discusses communication development with these 7 levels of communication on the left here, right? From pre-intentional behaviors all the way up to language. We've organized those 7 levels into 3 major categories or major levels, and that's students who are currently expressively emerging pre-symbolic communicators, right? That's a student who doesn't yet have an understanding of symbols, communicates through behaviors, their messages have to be interpreted, etc. Then their second one is concrete symbolic communicators who use conventional gestures, tangible symbols, photos, etc. And then finally, the third category is abstract symbolic communicators who use symbols or words, okay? That's just to make it a little easier to recognize and adapt around. And let's see. Okay, so got a little bit of background considerations about CVI, just understanding key points to adapting anything for a child in phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3. And here's sort of like the starting point for the using this tool specifically. You've got CVI range results, phase 1, and then we split phase 2 into early and late phase 2 because they are quite different depending on whether a student has or doesn't have eye to object contact, and phase 3. And then on the top here on this chart, you've got emerging pre-symbolic, concrete, and abstract, those 3 levels of communication development. So what you would do is you would mark an X or a checkbox in whatever the connection between these 2 things were. I have a child who's in late phase 2 and is a concrete communicator. So I'm putting a check right there in the middle. If you have a child or a student who is in between phases or in between levels of communication, you can mark both boxes, because what this is going to do is it's going to guide you to what considerations you need to look at the rest of this chart. So I've got my student who is in late phase 2 concrete symbolic. So I'm going to go down, and for each phase and each level, I've got pretty comprehensive suggestions or guidelines for how you might adapt specific appropriate communication systems for this child. And we made them little boxes so that you can check off whichever ones are relevant for your child. We're not saying use all of these all the time. We're saying here's all the things that you should be thinking about, and now let's check off which ones are critical for your child. And so this is phase 1, right? Emerging, pre-symbolic, concrete, and abstract. Okay, keeps going. And then you'll see at the bottom of each phase, we also have some considerations for receptive access to sign language, as well as what we call tactile input systems, which include protactile and haptics. Okay. Okay, phase 2 early. Same thing. What you're going to see is as it goes on, the adaptations actually increase in amount as opposed to decrease. It's something to understand about CVI. Kids in phase 3 and late phase 2, they don't need less adaptations. They actually need more very often because they're using their vision more throughout the day. Okay, so we see a lot more, considerations for sign language as we go into phase 2. Late phase 2. Now, remember, I said my student I'm thinking of is in late phase 2 and is a concrete symbolic communicator. So I'm just going to go down that list, and I'm going to look at those considerations that are just only in the middle column of that list, and I'm going to check off all the ones that I think are important to my student. Now, if she maybe has a few beginning abstract words, maybe she's starting to sign more or starting to identify like a photo, then I might look over on the right column as well and think if any of those considerations might be helpful for my student. Okay. Okay, and we keep going down, and we see, right, even more considerations as it goes. And then here's phase 3, right? So it's actually, it looks pretty extensive, right? It looks like a lot of information, but hopefully it's actually fairly straightforward. You don't need to look at all of the information on this. You just need to find out where your student is and go down to it and find it. And I see Julie's asking, oh, did we test it yet? We have a handful of people when we presented on this the first time for the Maryland project. We had a handful of people who were interested in testing it out. And I think we're currently working on that. But if anybody's interested in testing it out and seeing what you think, I would love that. And we would really love to hear your feedback. I wish that we could do we're not research grants, so we don't really engage in research in that way. But if anybody else wants to use it and do some research, please, we would love that. And certainly, we thought of this as really a functional instrument to just help people clarify the very significant confusion around adapting communication for kids with CVI. So if it's useful for you, or if it's not, we would love to know. Okay, so the other thing, so you can see that the tool itself is fairly straightforward, and you just want to find the column that applies to your student. But what I'm really excited about with this tool as well is that we made a pretty extensive appendix or an index of terms, because we realized we were throwing a lot of terms out there that people wouldn't necessarily know, like touch cues and tangible symbols and hand under hand and so on. And so for each of those terms, we have a little section in the appendix that explains what it is and gives pretty thorough examples, right? Touch cues, tactile name cues, tangible symbols, and there's that whole explanation of iconicity, and there's this whole explanation of anticipation calendar versus communication system with photos, links to all of those things that we discussed, right? Explanations of all these other terms that we use, right? Hand under hand, etc. And then the additional resources actually has links to all of the articles and all of the, the places that we got our information, including, a lot of this stuff on CVI specific content, right? References here, you're going to find the links to those California Deafblind services, fact sheets, to the communication matrix, to Barbara Miles's article about hand under hand, and so on. And that's it. That's the instrument. So I'm happy to send that over to you. Let's just go back into the presentation. So that's the AAC CVI matrix. What it looks at is applying CVI interventions by phase and characteristic to AAC. And I'm going to skim through some of this. A lot of this we've already discussed, but we're looking at phase 1 considerations, where in phase 1, there's just no way that the child is processing 2D. Looking is a goal in itself. The goal of phase 1 is just building visual behavior. So kids in phase 1 are only able to look at things when they have the highest level of environmental control. So in that case, there may be a tactile component to communication. There may be a tactile component to anything you're showing the child. There may be an auditory component if the child has access to auditory information. And if they don't, you need to really consider the extent to which the child has access to tactile information and when vision is going to be used. Right, so in phase 1, you would just be looking at whatever, specific area. So you might have a student in phase 1 who's an emerging pre-symbolic. I haven't seen many kids who are in phase 1 and abstract communicators, but everything we know about CVI suggests that there's really no connection between phase of CVI and communication development. I think it's really just that, if you have more access to vision, you're going to be able to observe more, and so there might be like a correlation, like a loose correlation, but not a strong one. So that's, really to get the background stuff on CVI intervention, I would just suggest going more into the CVI intervention content. What we're doing is taking the CVI intervention content and applying it to communication. And I want to breeze through a little bit of this so I can give you more examples of specific adaptations to AAC. In phase 2, the child is able to use their vision and activities if they have the right adaptations and if they have the right opportunities. And there's a difference, like we've said a few times, between early and late phase 2. That difference is eye to object contact, right? 2D access. It's not until around 4 or 5 on the range. So the question that you're asking in phase 2 is, what do I need to adapt in this child's day, and in this context, in the child's communication system, in order to use their vision at targeted points in the routine? Okay. That's where we bring in things like the CVI schedule and other planning tools, which are used in order to literally plot out in every activity all throughout the day, what is it that I need to adapt in order for the child to use their vision. Okay. So, again, you're in phase 2. Now just look at which is the section that applies to your student. And this is individual. To clarify some things about tangible symbols as they relate to CVI. Tangible symbols are traditionally used for students with ocular visual impairments, right? Question, are these visual tools expensive for the child to use? No, the only thing that's expensive is like high-tech devices, right? And if a child needs a high-tech device, then the child, the family and the school should not have to pay for it. It's really that's something that you would obtain through an assistive technology evaluation or an AAC evaluation, and it would be mandated for the child. Everything else that I've used is, dollar store materials. Or if your child is registered with the American Printing House for the Blind, you can get those STACS, S-T-A-C-S, the STACS tangible symbols for free. They're on the quota funds. So clarifying some things about tangible symbols, right? Traditionally, we think of tangible symbols the tactile ones as being based on tactile properties, not visual. So for a learner who is accessing them tactily, who is blind from an ocular visual impairment, we don't want to use miniatures, right? So like up on the top right, the miniature bus with the little, circle and crossed out, no miniatures. Miniatures are bad for tactile learners because it doesn't actually feel anything like what it represents, right? The little toy bus doesn't actually feel like the experience of being on a bus, right? We want to instead use something that actually bears a tactile resemblance rather than a visual resemblance. The purpose, right, as we've talked about, is to create that bridge between pre-symbolic and symbolic modes to provide a concrete referent. It's not intended to be an end. Okay. For kids with CVI, we need to think about this in a little bit of a different way. We are selecting them based on visual properties, not tactile. And even for a student in phase 1, select them somewhat at least based on visual properties. This is the opposite of symbols for students who have ocular visual impairments. Consider the complexity of a symbol, visual complexity and the symbolic or conceptual complexity. And whatever adaptations you're making, they're based on the child's visual, their functional vision results. Yeah, I see, Jennifer, miniatures are my pet peeve. Yeah, don't use miniatures. Miniatures are only understandable if you have excellent vision and are able to look at something and be able to make the connection between that little tiny thing and then the big thing out there. So a much more appropriate symbol for a school bus would be like a piece of the seatbelt or, a piece of that terrible pleather material that they use on those seats. This was pretty cool. Are we switching?
No, go ahead. After you're done, we'll go ahead and do an interpreter switch.
Oh, cool. So I'm glad that I made you laugh. So here on the right, you see, this was a really cool example from a TVI in New York City who made her own tangible symbol for a light box for a student with CVI, because the symbol for a light box that they had, it wasn't really visually connecting with her student. So she got from Home Depot just one of those little reattachable, portable light switches. It's like $5. And when you turn the switch, it actually lights up. So it had a really nice sort of cause and effect connection with the experience of turning on the light box. We'll let you guys switch. Let's see, Beth. No, the school district should pay for the device. I don't mean like the school itself, the school district, with funds, supported by the federal government, by IDEA, under the student's IEP, should be paying for a device if the child needs the device. If it's determined they don't need the device, then it's out of pocket. But this is where you just need support to be able to understand and, to be able to show a district when a student actually could benefit from something. Okay, I want to show you an example, and I love this video. It's a video of a speech pathologist working with a student who is in probably mid to late phase 2 of CVI. She also has dual cochlear implants, and at the point that you're seeing her now, she's definitely a concrete communicator, meaning that she knows the meaning of some of these symbols, but she's just starting to turn them into like a real communication system and not just an anticipation calendar. And so as you watch this video, what we're looking for is what are the communication adaptations and what are the CVI adaptations, and how do they kind of overlap here? And I'm gonna play my audio, but I just want to tell you, if you don't have access to the audio, it's very simple language that she's saying here, that the speech pathologist is saying here. This is a student with cochlear implants who used to access communication language mostly through tactile sign, but she's now at the point with her cochlear implants where she's getting some good auditory input, she's accessing some speech, but she's still looking for the sign visually and tactily. All that the speech pathologist is saying is she's walking her through the calendar. She's saying, TOD, your TOD, Sarah, teacher of the deaf, Sarah, is finished. It's all done. All right, reading is finished with her. Next, it's going to be time for speech, and then you're going to go to circle time, and then you're going to have a drink. So let's just watch that.
You go to your schedule. Yes. Sarah's okay. Great. Look. Miss Sarah, she's still here, but we'll do it for now. Good. Over. Over. Okay. Your book is all done. Hmm? Yes. Okay, Maeve. Now it's time for speech. Flip it over. Speech. Hmm? And then morning meeting. Hmm? And then Miss Becky, what's after morning meeting? Drink. And then drink. Okay. Yes, it's time for speech right now. Are you ready? Let's go.
Okay, so, and I do see Marilyn also mentioned the I Can Connect program. If you have a student who has vision and hearing loss and could benefit from a communication device for personal use, I Can Connect can provide free iPads. So do reach out to Marilyn or your Deafblind project. Yeah, and Donna, thank you. Yeah, I love how she reconnects with the teacher, reaches out. Yeah, so you see she's really reaching out and still looking for that tactile support. So let's just talk first about what are the CVI adaptations? What did you notice from a CVI perspective? Any concrete visual adaptations you can identify? Black background, definitely. Oh yeah, the red lines around the symbols and the box. Yeah, the red rectangle on the left of the communication board is good because it's actually it's almost like a landmark or a visual anchor, the use of color to visually anchor the child's attention to that important space, which is what are we doing now? And it's just a little bit bigger than the symbols, so it almost provides a red outline around the symbol that we're doing now. And then the red electrical tape around the finished box, that's really important because we remember that the lower visual field is much more difficult for a child with CVI, almost always. So it provides like a bright color that really pops out in her lower visual field. Yeah, yep, thank you, Marcy. Marcy noticed, and I really wished, as I watched this video, I wish that when I was taking this video that I had just turned the camera just a little bit to the left, because what you would have seen is a very busy classroom. And even the decision to do this activity in this place, in this part of the classroom itself, is an adaptation, and it's an important one. The tactile materials, right? It's the fact that she's using 3D symbols. She's not quite ready for 2D symbols at this point yet, okay? And that's pretty good, great. And then the spacing between the symbols would also be a good one. How about even for visual fields, the choice to do this at at eye level rather than on a tray table on top of her Riften chair or desk. So that itself is an accommodation made for visual fields. I think you got all of them. And how about the communication modifications? What are the communication modifications that are being made? Definitely the way that she uses her voice, it's very clear, very clear language that she's using. Right, repeating words. Hand under hand, definitely. Yep, minimal language, small steps now and then. And great. Yeah, that's definitely like a nice hand under hand support that she's giving her there. The wait time itself is a communication adaptation. Also, the use of multiple modalities of communication. She's using visual and tactile sign because that's what the student's looking for. She's using tangible symbols. She's using speech because she knows that the student has some access to speech, right? This is truly the use of multiple modalities, or what some people would refer to as total communication, but also the wait time and the least restrictive prompting. Okay, so sometimes when I've showed that video to folks, and actually even just when I was watching it the first time, I thought, okay, well, how do we go forward from there? That looks great. But what's next? We need systems that are able to grow with the child. That child was a phase 2, was late, mid to late phase 2 concrete communicator. But what happens when she's in late phase 2 or phase 3 and she's an abstract communicator and these symbols are no longer the appropriate symbols for her? How do we have systems that grow with the child from 3D to 2D, from pre-symbolic to symbolic, and then on into developing complex language? Well, exactly what happened with that student. Once she was ready for 2D, we didn't want to just take away the symbols that she had learned. So we started switching them, transitioning one at a time with photos of those same symbols. And we could do that either on an iPad or on a communication board, or both, right? Because you want to be able to have a low-tech version of any high-tech system that you have. So this is a photograph, right? Laminated photographs, and do mind the glare, right? Because laminated photographs do have some degree of glare. So just be mindful of that, right? You have laminated photographs on a communication board with an increased array as we start to transition into using a more complex communication system. The student may also be able to do that on an iPad. Don't forget about visual fields, because when you see this one on the right side, when it's not on a slant board, you see she's really bending over it. And you can get matte laminator sheets for sure. Other ways of thinking about visual fields, right? Not just slant boards, but also stands. This is a gooseneck stand for an iPad. It's really helpful because you can actually manipulate it exactly what direction you want. For partner assisted scanning, using something like what I'm holding up right now, a little window to be able to show the student something. And we don't have to get all into partner assisted scanning. It's a whole separate presentation. But I did want to show you, just in the interest of time, I want to skip a little bit and show you a couple of important things. I do have a whole section here on phase 3 intervention, which always gets the short end of the stick because it's comes after phase 1 and 2. But this is just to show you some examples. And I want to just point out this one on the right, bottom right. Salient feature instruction is critical in late phase 2 and early phase 3. If you're not familiar with that term, the salient feature is the unique part of a symbol or of anything, an object or a 2D thing, that gives it unique meaning, right? Kids in phase 3 are able to look around and use their vision throughout the day, but they need adaptations to support them to understand what they're looking at. So here are, on the bottom middle, examples of the most kind of classically challenging board maker symbols, right? The happy and sad symbols. Now, to a student with CVI, these look almost the same, right? They're not visually distinct at all. So what we want to be starting to think about is, what is that critical component or salient feature that makes something look unique? And we might think about starting to adapt symbols in this way. So maybe we're going to do this, right? Maybe we're going to say, well, it's the smile. So we're going to use one color to highlight the smile and then another color to highlight the frown for happy, sad. If you're doing this, you might also think, well, does my student need that sight word there? Or is my student not there yet and the sight word is really just extra visual clutter? So let's take the sight words away. But if you're doing that, isn't it just as visually abstract, just as visually complex to use sight words themselves that are anchored or highlighted with unique colors. So we could start to substitute out sight words for images if your student's ready for that. And ultimately, the goal is that you have a communication system that's using, actual sight words as language. I'll show you some examples of that. There's lots more stuff I could tell you about salient feature instruction here, and it's all in the PowerPoint. For the last few slides, last few things, I just want to show you some color considerations. Okay, this was a real system that a real student who I worked with had, and I'm going to wrap it up really quickly. I know we only have like 2 minutes. You had these very abstract symbols, right? I bet the one that you can obviously think of is that the green arrow in the middle means go, right? The heart means like. I don't know what the other ones even mean. But the idea is that you have, very visually distinct symbols that mean very distinct things, right? And this is a communication array on an iPad, right? And you have some cells that are masked, which means that they're blacked out, and we're going to introduce them at a later time. But if you're doing this, why not just substitute it with this? It's just as visually difficult, and we're giving the student, even if the student isn't yet a reader, we're using color to anchor their attention in the same way. And you can see these colors are even matched here. We're using bright colors to anchor the student's attention. There's more spacing between them. We're starting to get an idea of the shapes of words. There's really no difference conceptually between this one, which to me is totally abstract and is just such an unconventional symbol system that it's like, why don't you just go with something like this? Visually, it's just as easy. And conceptually, it's just as easy too. Okay, and here's where you might use like a little cutout window or occluder to be able to help direct the student's attention for partner-assisted scanning, as well as for visual modeling, as opposed to modeling by touching the device. You can model with a color outline. Okay, there's more considerations for high tech. There's just more examples of this stuff. Nothing, too wild that you're missing here. I think hopefully I got through the main points. There's this little page on visual and tactile modifications to sign, but all of that is there for you on the tool. And then there's some additional resources. And then here's my little thank you animation.